This is episode 121 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. On this week's episode, I am pleased to be joined by Lynn Gilroy. He is with the Reason Foundation, and he is Vice President of Government Reform and also the head of their Pension Integrity Project at that Reason Foundation. And Lynn, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate being here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on in an issue that people often try to ignore in the area of pensions, but before we jump into issues in New Mexico's government employee pension systems, why don't you talk about your organization? Reason is a big outfit. They do a lot of different things, but you're a little part of that organization, and why pensions are an issue that free market conservatives, libertarians, even tax and spend liberals might have an interest in the outcome of pension discussions.
Hey, thanks, Paul. That's a fantastic question, the way you set that up, because I think you're exactly right. This is one of those issues that is it's a looming financial issue out there, and depending on what state you're in, of some level of severity, some pretty bad off, some states doing okay, and many though that are on a path that I think we would all say is risky. And it's risky both for, if you're looking at it from a taxpayer perspective or a public employee perspective, or really whatever hat you want to put on. And so I guess the overview of the problem, or the reason this is an issue, to go to your high level question, is that depending on how you value it, today you have anywhere between 1.6 trillion and 6 trillion or so in unfunded public sector pension liabilities. And what I mean by that is that's between somewhere generally around 2 to 6 trillion to ballpark it, of unfunded promises that have been made, retirement benefit promises that have been made to state and local government workers primarily, some federal, but mostly we're talking state and local, and in which the funds that are going to be necessary to set aside to cover all of those promises just aren't there. They haven't been set aside. We'll talk about that in your context in New Mexico soon, and in a few minutes to kind of localize it. But at a high level, for a variety of reasons, I mean, you sort of expect when you're talking about pensions, retirement plans, and things that involve investment, you have issues like recessions that will, actually have a meaningful impact on that, right? And so we've had 2 of those in the last 20 years or so. That's been an impact, but it's beyond that. I think we've seen some fundamental shifts in our economy globally that have, for instance, dropped our interest rates down to low or near record lows, and things like that have made what back in the 1950s, 1960s, even through the 1990s, promises that seemed like they were fully funded and going to be sustainable and no issue to take care of, actually, in light of a changed economic world, now look very different. And we've realized that we've actually made at many levels of government some promises that are actually very expensive retirement promises to keep, and didn't set us in sort of, we're hoping that they weren't going to be as expensive as they were, and for various reasons didn't set aside enough. And so then that becomes a debt. And like Paul, as you well know, and anyone who understands public finance and debt, you can have some, but at some point when you have debt that's growing and on autopilot, if you will, that can be a major drain and impact on your fiscal health, in terms of taking you from being, sort of AAA rated kind of governments down to, down through lower levels of credit rating. And then we know what increasing debt looks like from a fiscal perspective, and crowd out and that sort of thing. And pensions are a form for many states, including New Mexico, of debt that will need to be reckoned with.
So let's take a step back. And I know most folks listening probably are aware basically how this works, but talk about some of the key differences between, the retirement system open to most folks in the private sector, and what a government employee pension looks like. The defined contribution versus defined benefit system. What are the big differences there?
Sure. Okay. Well, so for I think what most people that work in the private sector are generally used to is either something like a 401k or a 401a or sometimes a 403b plan, depending on if you're in the nonprofit sector or not, which are retirement plans created by the tax code in which you tend to have some combination of employer contributions, which is discretionary at depending on the type of plan you're in and what the employer's policies are, of course, matching and that sort of thing. And then, of course, your own personal savings. So you might say, I want to set 5% of my paycheck aside to put into this, like a 403b or 401k, hopefully, matched by an employer contribution to where, generally what you want people setting aside in that kind of environment, especially if you're talking about folks that are in Social Security, if you're setting consistently from when you enter the workforce, a good 10 to 15%. This is rule of thumb that investment advisors would sort of say. I'm not one, to be very clear, but they would say generally you set 10 or 15% aside total, employer plus employee aside in one of those accounts, and that plus Social Security will get you, assuming, reasonable rates of growth and that sort of thing in the markets, a healthy retirement. What as often has been actually what that though has is replacing in the private sector and what still exists in many public entities today is what's called a defined benefit pension system. And it's a different type of retirement system. And it's one in which essentially you commit to paying a set percent effectively of a final average salary, if you will. Some you take the last several years of different calculation methodologies depending on where you are, but you take some blend of like the last several years of someone's salary. You take an average of that and multiply it by various factors to get a dollar figure that would be an annual benefit that would be promised in retirement. And those are basically determined by formula and are usually protected at a minimum level by the contracts clauses in the state and federal constitutions, meaning once that sort of formula is set, the courts have treated that as basically a guaranteed benefit that outside of very extenuating circumstances can't be diminished. So it's basically an ironclad promise. And in some states, like my particular state next door to you in Arizona, Illinois, I think Hawaii, a few others have actually put in even stronger protections on pensions in their state constitutions to ensure that those promises once made are kept. And so effectively you have a system that once is in place, you make the promise, you need to be ready to conservatively fund that promise. And that hasn't happened in a lot of places. And so as you can imagine, governments have lots of shiny new things and that they like to spend money on and paying just for the benefits of folks that have worked in the past and continuing to make those contributions doesn't necessarily look as attractive in those budget fights. And so some states have skimped, and we've seen, that become a major problem in terms of how underfunding has happened in some places.
Yeah. And before we can maybe talk in detail about the big New Mexico retirement plans, some of the pitfalls of these defined contribution plans offered by governments, you just mentioned underfunding. Now, it's always a concern, I think, for anybody, not just philosophically inclined, libertarian types, to the government putting them in charge of a system for workers that they'll not benefit from. Saying you start working when you're in your 20s and then you work 35 years, and it's supposed to be there when you get done working and are set to retire. We've seen major problems with Social Security and Medicare at the federal levels in terms of their funding. Why are there issues, just broadly speaking? Because New Mexico is by no means the only state having issues with its pension systems. Like, what is it? The stock market returns aren't what they expect, or are they maybe being too ambitious in those returns? Underfunding? all of the above? And are there more issues than even those?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, Paul. Because I mean, as you sort of illuminate in your question, there are a lot of moving pieces to this sort of thing, and I guess I would just say that to zoom up to the meta level, to your question, it's very, as people live longer historically, over time we've seen life expectancy. Now, in the last couple of years, we've seen, I think, that maybe peak a little bit. And, we're starting to see some pullback on that. And there are various theories about that. I won't get into that here. But for the most part, we have seen a history of growing life expectancy. And, when you're talking about basically promising, certain levels, it doesn't matter what kind of benefit you're talking about. Making sure that there's enough money in that kind of environment, whether it's a defined contribution plan, a defined benefit plan, Social Security, which looks different than all of them, and other or hybrids of them all. You have to be willing to recognize that, people live a long time, and to guarantee some level of like retirement benefit that keeps a certain quality of life is going to be expensive. And the question is, how much risk do you want to take that you're going to be wrong? And so in a system for the employers, then, like a government, what's happened is, and you say what's happened in the defined benefit plans? It's not so much that there's something structurally wrong with defined benefit plans as a tool or something that makes it, not work, and so therefore you get all these unfunded liabilities. It's not that. It's that it's just the way, in terms of design, the way that many of them, and not all, there are many states, or at least I should say several states, like Wisconsin, South Dakota, New York, North Carolina, states that have been, and are today about 100% funded, maybe a little overfunded, that took a little hit in the recession like you would expect, and then, weathered it because they had built-in mechanisms that allowed them to do so. So the system was sort of built to take shocks. But a lot of plans aren't built like that, and so it comes down in a lot of ways to design. And so, like you said, when you have a great recession, when you have the sort of 2000, 2001 sort of market dynamics that were happening even before that, those are gonna have an impact. And I mentioned earlier something as profound as, back 20 or 30 years ago, a pension plan, for instance, that based all of its assumptions on trying to target about an 8% average investment return, which for a long time was normal. That was easy to do. You didn't have to take much risk. You can invest in bonds because, interest rates were double digits. You can invest in really safe stuff and basically have no problem meeting this kind of retirement promise, right? It was when the whole global marketplace shifted. And over the last 20 years, we've seen a pressure downward on interest rates that has pushed them into ultra low territory, even negative. In some countries, there's a piece just the day we're recording this in a major national newspaper about that. And could that happen here is sort of the question of, could we have negative interest rates in the U.S.? And so some fundamental things have changed that make a system where you're promising ironclad benefits for decades out into the future, where if you're slightly wrong on assumptions here or there, it's going to have big butterfly effect type impacts down the road. And that's what, if the systems are left open to that kind of exposure, which many are, then you're going to have that kind of problem.
All right. So let's take this discussion to New Mexico itself. And, first and foremost, we have two major systems, the ERB and the PERA, that are involved in retirement. Can you speak about those, briefly in terms of who they serve and what they do, if it's the same or slightly different?
Right. You have two major systems in New Mexico, as you mentioned, and so there are two pension systems. One called the Public Employees Retirement Association of New Mexico. It's PERA, and so that has been maybe in the news lately. Folks have probably seen that lately in the news, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That one generally serves most state employees that are not in schools, they're not working for school districts. We're talking about traditional kind of public employees, people working for your DOT, things like that. And then you also have what's called the Education Retirement Board, the ERB. That's serving teachers. That's a teacher retirement plan. And so when you sort of take the two together, So we took a look at I'll give you some data that's current as of the fiscal year end 2017, which is pretty recent. I mean, in terms of the data that's available, I think there may be some 1 year that's slightly updated here, but it'll give you a current snapshot for the most part. You're looking, if you take the two together, they basically have altogether roughly $40 billion in promises that have been made in terms of pension benefits. And that's where actuaries sort of look at it and say, well, if we assume, like everybody that's currently working today, if they work as long as we assume the average works, you make a lot of assumptions, right? Because you have to think, we assume they're going to work to a certain length, and then they're going to retire, and then maybe they're married. We're going to assume they get married at some point. We're going to assume their salary grows this way over their tenure. We're going to assume, so they're projecting out a lot, as you can tell, just with that little thought experiment, out for decades into the future to try to then reverse engineer it back to what do we have to put in today to basically put in today to get invested that will then generate market returns to then be able to pay out that 40 billion or so in combined benefits. And it's roughly equivalent or so between the systems. Roughly 50-50 or so plus or minus in terms of promises. But then you look at, well, what do they have on hand? And then you start to see a deviation. And there you see that Para is a little bit better funded. They're about 73% funded as of that, the 2017 valuation report, which is something they put out every year to sort of measure this stuff. And ERB is about 63% funded, not as well funded. There are various reasons behind that, and I'll talk a little bit about Para specifically. We haven't dug back into all the specifics of ERB, but we'll go back and look into, my team went back and looked into Para and where unfunded liabilities came from. But if you add them all up, you basically have made 40 billion in promises, and you have about 13 billion or so that you do not have on hand today that needs to be there to live up to those promises. And so if you add it all up, you have about just shy of 70% of what you need in the long run to be able to pay out all those benefits that are, as I said, constitutionally guaranteed. So that's the high level trend.
Now, by 70%, what you're saying is not that 70% of the money is there, but 70% of the money that's supposed to be there is there, because obviously, the world of investing and compound interest, and you expect money to grow. But if you're only starting out with 70% of the money that you're going to need down the road, unless the market is able to make up for 30%, or you put more money in, or something changes, you're very unlikely to have enough money at the end. In fact, because of compounding interest and investing, you're likely to be more short than 70%. Is that an accurate way to put it, or am I kind of butchering the whole thing? These things are pretty complicated.
No, it's extremely complicated, and Paul, you did a great job there. So I guess the way I just sort of think about the way I would explain it, and I would say that, part of the reason I think that you could say that they're there is that to answer your highest level question is it's money that should be there right now. Effectively, think about it this way. If you look at your own retirement plan, or if you look at the markets and you look at the last decade or so, arguably, I realize there's some volatility the last few weeks. There always is that. But basically, we're kind of at the peak of a market. If you look back historically and you look back, the last 10 years, you look at a massive run up in the Dow and the S&P, since the Great Recession, right? And then you look at, well, what's happened to pension funds over that time? And you see basically there's been a general decline or just maybe a middling hovering, around the 70% range in aggregate. We've seen a lot of that. And it's because there's a lot more going on than just investment returns in pension systems and the dynamics going on. There's other assumptions at play. There's mortality. There's how you think about salary and payroll growth, and what happens when you start squeezing on salary, but you assume salary is going to grow in your pension system. And if it doesn't, you're not putting in enough to keep up with it. You get all these perverse dynamics, Paul, that really start to layer in, right? So it's not just one thing, it's layering in. And then you get something that is, and I'll just apologize now for being such a nerd, but negative amortization is a term that we talk about. And that's something that we just thought we've see this in a lot of plans these days, but it's something where effectively you're not putting in enough each year, contributing, just making your contributions to even keep that debt from falling, right? So from rising, sorry. So basically you're not putting in enough to keep your debt from getting higher. You're not paying it down. And so the longer debt sits out there, pension debt, meaning unfunded liabilities, the money that needs to be there today to compound, like you say, if you're sitting at 70% funded at the top of the market, then there are very scary winds, kind of blowing ahead, because, you want to be fully funded. A healthy pension system right now should be, arguably 100% or, even higher, because you want to be following that business cycle. You want to be super funded when things are good. You want to keep that cushion there for when things go south, like the bad, times we've had in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, the market is at a very high point,
sure.
and the fact that we're so underfunded in New Mexico is a real indicator that something is fundamentally wrong with our pension programs here. And I'll just throw out one more fact, and basically, note that I think a year and a half ago, New Mexico saw a downgrade from Moody's, which is one of the big debt rating services, and Moody's tied their downgrade to the fact that our pension system is in such dire shape. So I guess the big questions are why? What happened to get New Mexico into this mess? And then, let's start with that, because the governor has just proposed her own ideas on some pension reforms, and we want to talk about what needs to be done versus what the governor's done, and whether that's in the right ballpark or a lot more. So let's start with, though, how did we get into this huge mess with New Mexico's pension systems?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I'm going to use PARA as an example, because then we can walk right into the recommendations, as the conversation goes on. So just to put some perspective on it, so for the listener, again, this is the Public Employee Retirees Association. Public Employees Retiree Association in New Mexico. This is covering basically, most state employees, not schools. Teachers are covered under another plan. So if you rewind the clock to 2003, you had a plan that was basically fully funded. If you go back to 2001, I'll just go back that far. You were $419 million overfunded in that plan. So that's just 2001. And that equates to about 105% funded. So back then, things were sort of working along the lines as I described. You were at the top of the market and you were overfunded. What we didn't see coming was sort of the underlying structural shifts that actually came, after that. And what happened is a mountain of debt that accrued. It started to take off right after that. And, about 2003 is when you were basically even. And then from 2003 to 2008, you were hovering under several hundred million underfunded, but we're kind of hovering steady. And then once the recession hit, then it just spiked. And then you saw numbers jump from, under $1 billion up to over $6 billion and higher than that in underfunding. And then since then, there's been a few moves since then to add contributions or to make some changes to the system to basically limit either cost increase contributions or limit the accrual of liabilities in some way. And so since then, you saw a little downward peak again, and that went down to about 2014 when it kind of went down to about 4 billion or so, 4.5 billion underfunded. But it's sort of spiked up again since then. And so you're looking at today, as of the end of the last fiscal year, 2018 numbers, just over 6 billion underfunded in that system. So that tells you nothing, though, except where there's a lot of debt, right? But where did it come from becomes the question. And so just for perspective, now that plan is 71% funded. So 6 billion underfunded, that translates to a funded ratio, what they call of 71% funded. But we looked at where did that come from? And the plans themselves report, like every year, they sort of report how things change. And so we just went back historically and scraped the data back and looked at rewinding that to look at where did that come from since they were fully funded. And effectively, what we, the bulk of it is coming from underperforming investments like you expect. And, in there you're looking at anywhere, but close to about 3 billion or so, according to our estimates. But I mean, that's basically again, aggregated from the plan documents that they put out every year. Negative amortization is another piece that we see impacting this plan. And
you gotta define that term before we. I can't let you get away with using that term again. You described it to me in a recent email discussion. So, what is negative amortization?
It's just again, you're not paying in enough. It's like not putting in the minimum on your credit card. Or you're just seeing the debt continue to grow. You're paying in, but it's not at a level sufficient to keep that debt from growing. Because basically, in the world of pension math, you're effectively, you have to assume that the way they treat it, they assume that their debt is growing as fast as their assets, and so they're basically expecting that as a 7+% clip. So if you don't tip up with that in terms of contribution rates, then you're treading water, or maybe sinking a little bit. And the hope is that over time, investment returns overperform, or that you have the salary growth increases so much that like the amount of money being put in catches up. But it's a negative cycle of basically you're putting in your money, but your debt keeps growing, and so it just all continues to balloon.
So that might be if you have, say, a home mortgage, paying off the mortgage, the interest on that mortgage, but not paying off any of the principal whatsoever. But
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
And another question, and I'm going to refer people in the show notes to an excellent commentary. New Mexico takes steps to reform teacher pensions, but more is needed. It's written by some of your colleagues there at the Reason Foundation, Anil Narula and Andrew Abbott. And a really relevant chart here showing actual contributions versus contributions not made. And, as you stated, it's worth reiterating, it's amazing to me to even contemplate, but back in 2001, New Mexico's pension system was fully funded, or at least, this was the ERB, so it's worth pointing that out, but the ERB was fully funded, really, I think in 2002 even. 2003 is where things start to get shortchanged. And I went back and confirmed Gary Johnson was governor until 2003. And then he was replaced, of course, by Bill Richardson. So Johnson left at the beginning of 2003. He essentially was no longer governor. So we're really talking, the problem starts to get grow really under Bill Richardson, who's governor then starting in 2003 for that legislative session and then for the next 8 years. Now, when you say contributions not made, people think back to 2003, 2004. These are pretty darn good economic times. Things didn't really hit the fan in New Mexico until 2008 when the economic downturn happened. So why would a governor or a legislature, especially in good economic times, not make the contributions necessary to these pension plans?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on where you are. There's going to be a different answer, but a variety of reasons would include things like they want to spend the money elsewhere. Of course, is number one reason for lots of decision making that we all see, right? Just a desire to. There's some other thing that I would rather spend that on, and hey, we've been fully funded. Everything's been historically good. We don't see we're looking in the rearview mirror, and things look good in the rearview mirror. Everything's shiny, the sun's shining. We hit our returns on average. People are getting their benefit checks. It's 100% funded. Looks great. Not looking at the clouds kind of on the horizon ahead, outside our windshield, and so I think there's I don't know in New Mexico's case what that was back then. It could be that. It could be lingering effects of layering in some impacts from the recession that hit the 2001, and so maybe there was some impact there that made a contribution rate increase higher than expected. Maybe that was beyond the budget threshold. I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but I guess I would just say sometimes there's legit reasons, but we know from the, New Jersey's and Illinois and Kentucky's of the world that often the contributions not made are because they just wanted to spend it on something else and didn't want to pay the bill, right? And I think, I think this is something that taxpayers, libertarians, public employees, progressives should all be equally appalled by. And the reason I say that is because, if you're the most hardcore libertarian, you believe in contractually, you believe in contracts, and, pensions are viewed as contractually vested rights. And so if an employer, no matter whether or not you believe that job should be public or private, those are debates for, part of the policy making spectrum. But once that's settled and people are taking a retirement, in good faith, sitting across the table from an employer, signing up for a benefit and a promise, then I think we all, and everyone is constitutionally on the hook, and it's viewed as a contractually vested right, you got to pay that. And so when states decided, we can get away with it, for whatever reason, things are good, the markets are going to go up forever, I think a certain amount of hubris from the late 90s kind of played into a lot of decisions. I mean, California did the worst, which they looked at overfunding and said, hey, let's give that out as benefit increases. And even better, let's give it out as retroactive benefit increases. And so they looked at a situation like that and said, blue skies forever, and gave out a massive benefit increase that now has produced hundreds of billions of unfunded liabilities that dwarf, everything that you're looking at there.
Now, Lynn,
it's all some version. Same thing. Yep.
We're not starting to run too short on time, but I want to
Sure.
get on to solutions in just a second. But
Yep.
I have one more question, and again, I will put a link to your article and another subsequent more in-depth document. So the contributions not made, this red line that bobs up and down here as a percentage of the actual contribution, and you have a contribution not made. That red line, that kind of warning flag to me, it grows and contracts over the years, seemingly at random. Generally speaking, the situation's gotten worse, but there were some really bad years, 2011, 2012, 2013. Then it starts to decline in 2014, 2015, 16, 17, but in 2018, that contributions not made situation worsens. Now this is fast forwarding into the Martinez administration, and New Mexico's economy wasn't so hot coming out of the Great Recession. It took us quite a while to recover. Revenues certainly didn't grow that quickly. Any ideas why this situation seemingly improved for quite a while? Is it just kind of that same randomness of decision making, potentially using limited funds for other things? Any idea, clues, what's going on here?
I mean, what I see in it is a little different, Paul, and I see sort of the push and pull of like recessionary budgets happening. And so basically the way it works is that, where you get, you have to forecast everything. And so like whatever you get today, when you get the latest pension report today, you are basically putting into, the actuaries are telling you what 2 years from now you need to be putting in to basically make up for like all the gaps that you had before. So every new year of debt you layer in, keeps coming, but that's going to be 2 years out because it has to have time to go through a process that then gets baked into the budget, that then gets paid, right? And so there's this fiscal process that happens that means you're always kind of catching up to the past. And so there's this, like pensions are a lagging indicator effectively sometimes in this dynamic, what folks will see when you link to it is basically, I think that you're saying that after the recession, basically 2009, 10, you look out to like 11, 12, 13, and you start to see some gaps start to build because that's when those contributions start to spike. So 12, 13, 14. And what's happening is you're just adding more debt. Things are happening. During that process also, there's another thing though that's happening. I should say that is, and there's some prudent things happening in here too. So I don't want to make it sound like it's just on autopilot. Some of this is the markets and you're just missing, and there's a timing effect. And so you're seeing the push and pull of markets and budgets, and as budgets stretch to absorb more, of what's happening out there. But the other thing that's happening is around 2000, I think, 12 or so, there were some reforms made and decisions to do things like lower the return, the assumption on the return, the investment return, which is basically saying we're going to start to acknowledge, now that we're not going to get the old 8% or whatever we thought in the market. But to do that, now we have to put in more upfront, right? And so you got to pay the piper. You either pay now or pay more later. Pay more now or pay even more later is usually the way it works. And so that's what you're seeing, Paul, is that. And then you see this rising. The thing to watch for anyone looking at the chart Paul is referencing is there's a line that shows the actuarially determined contribution. And that is a yellow line on that chart. And that's been on a steady rise. And what's happening there is more and more debts being recognized and more underperformance is being recognized. And you're not paying down your debt fast enough, so it's growing. And that's all kind of happening in here.
All right. Well, I'm holding in my hands an article by Dan McKay of the Albuquerque Journal, published Thursday, August 8th, which, by the way, I had already reached out to Lynn to ask him to be on the podcast when this story hit. So very timely discussion here, Lynn Gilroy, Reason Foundation. Now, you have had a chance to read through at least some of the high points of the governor's plan in terms of pension reforms. I will read directly from the article. Her recommendations are require most employees to dedicate more of their paychecks to the retirement plan. Their employers would pay more too, i.e. taxpayers really. An extra 2% of employees' salary with increased contributions phased in over 4 years. For the next 3 years, suspend the current 2% cost of living adjustment that retirees receive in their pensions. They would receive a lump sum at the end of each year equal to 2% of their annual pensions. After the first 3 years, move to a profit-sharing model for annual cost of living adjustments. The adjustment would generally fluctuate between 0.5% and 3% each year, depending on performance of the retirement system's investments and its overall financial health. Finally, low-income retirees, state police officers, and correctional officers would be exempt from some of the changes. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, Lynn. Give me a letter grade for the governor's proposed pension reforms.
Well, look, I'm gonna grade on a curve because it doesn't matter what party you are, what state you are, whether it's state, local, federal. It does take some courage to even broach these subjects. So I'll give a B minus C plus, and to explain that. Let me just back up a little bit and say that, so here they're looking at the para plan, and that's the one I just described. I think you'd look at the other plan for teachers, and I think you could say probably a lot of the same conversations need to be had. I hope they're having them. I'm not sure, where those discussions are, but they probably should be happening as well.
Okay, so that's worth noting by itself that this is only applicable to para. Any idea why they would only take that bite of that apple instead of going after both? Because both are, as you say, fairly significantly underfunded. Is it a political calculation? What do you think's going on there?
That I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I did not go back to look at the full charge of that group, and so whether they were tasked to, I don't know.
Para is the bigger one, though. Correct?
Well, I mean, in terms of liabilities, I would say in terms of promises made, they're not dissimilar. They're equivalent in scale. So I think you should. I mean, they both are comparable. And so to that, so I'd say whatever you're looking at with one should be evaluated with the other. And they're probably very different from the perspective of the mechanics and the levers under the hood, if you will, in terms of how things work. So there's no cookie cutter, to any of this, but. I think it does behoove the policymakers to keep this up. But just to look at para, and especially if you kind of look at the plans going back to the legislative session, you did have, some changes that were made in the legislative session to the teacher plan. Now, so I do want to be clear on that. There was a bill that passed. Now, I will say that it was a very mild reform, and that, Paul, may explain the answer that maybe they just said, well, we did something and, we will let that sit and then we'll come back to that later. It could be that. We see that happen all the time. Our analysis that Paul will link to on that one will just tell you that, basically they're putting in more money into that plan, which is needed, but it's nowhere close to what's going to be necessary to keep it solvent. So it's a step, but more needs to be done. And I think you could say the same thing about what we're seeing here in Para. Maybe just it's a little more, in terms of what they're building together. It's definitely a more holistic package of, a more, I guess, aggressive solution, if you will. And so what they're trying to do is basically change primarily things like they're trying to increase contributions into the system, which is going to be necessary. One way to think about it is, that you've been underpricing this stuff forever. Everybody was thinking that we're going to have this world of like the 1990s market returns going forever, and that's not happening, right? And so if that's the reality, you should have been putting in more the whole time. We all should have been doing that probably for all of our retirements, but the pension plan's not excluded. And so, you can't solve underfunding by saving money. It means you're going to have to spend more. So there's some of that. And then they're also looking at things like the COLA, the cost of living adjustment, and making some changes. You described a few of those. And they're I don't want to get into it. I mean, it's very complicated, at a technical level. It's the various pieces and parts of it. But basically what they're doing in a nutshell is they're saying they have a promise right now, like a cost of living adjustment, just for the listeners' context, is like one of the major, depending on how it's structured, can be one of the major cost drivers in a pension plan. Because those things are typically compounded, and you say, let's say you guarantee somebody they're going to get a 2 or 3% COLA in retirement that's compounded. That sounds like a small number, but you start turning that and compounding on, and if that's on autopilot, you start seeing benefits that quickly, that skyrocket. And then, you basically have in place a benefit increase mechanism that may or may not actually have any bearing, on how inflation is happening,
right,
which a cost of living adjustment is supposed to be, right? And
okay,
so
Lynn. That's a great point. Sorry, we're almost out of time here, but you're right about the 2%. That's absolutely, given low rates of inflation we've seen in recent years, that's leading to some nice cost of living adjustments for these people. So let's kind of summarize the situation here. So this only applies to Para, these reforms do. Would you say kind of yes or no? Is this something that, say if you were a free market think tank in the state in which this was being done, that this would be at least worth supporting in its current form? And of course, knowing that the special interests are going to be out in force, pushing back on weakening, because that's the direction that I fully expect that this idea would go. Would you say yes, this is a worthwhile reform for a free market advocate?
Well, if I were advising the head of a free market think tank in New Mexico, I would tell him that it's worth having this as an opening of a conversation that needs to happen. And this is like a set of words on paper at this point. And to me, that says, it's an opportunity then for a conversation. And the way I would frame it is, for anyone there, it should be not around cost. It should be around risk reduction. And if you can frame a conversation around how this is a good start, but it does not, for instance, make your cost of living adjustment in the future really a true inflation kind of measure. And it does leave a certain amount of autopilot there that is a risk. And there's also a lot more risk down in the system on the investment side that I mentioned that's driving some of this underfunding and all of that. And so I would say it's a constructive platform to start with, and it's worth convening a bunch of folks around the table to say, okay, is this enough? Because you're absolutely right. That happened with the ERB reforms earlier this year. What was originally proposed was more aggressive, and along the way through the political process, what would have been a pretty decent stab at improving the pension solvency through higher contributions got whittled away, and became just a few pennies extra, if you will. And I don't want to diminish it. Every dollar is a dollar for a pension system, but relative to what was being discussed, was way smaller. So
all right,
yes, that point is well taken.
Thanks, Lynn. If they want to find your research specifically, I know Reason's website is very big. What site can they go to check out what you're up to? Yeah,
just come check us out at reason.org/pensions.
All right.
Reason.org/pensions.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post your comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.